We are going over the nervous system, chapter 14 today.
Yeah, I do that.
All right, on Wednesday, we're doing This Is Your Brain on Drugs.
Yep.
The activity where we play some games, there will be a quiz on that afterwards. And then chapter 16 is what we go over on Friday. So it's on Friday, but the assignment is due next Monday, so a week from today. So that's just a little bit about this week.
And will we have an assignment on next Monday?
Yep. So I guess we can keep going if you want. So Monday, oh my gosh, what day will that be? 19th? 19th?
Yeah.
So we do psychoactive drugs. Oops, I spelled that wrong. I'll just put drugs. So we do the drugs, and I normally used to break that into 2 class periods, but we're just going to do it all in one. It's 2 shorter PowerPoints. There are 2 assignments actually, because it's usually in 2 parts. Why am I spelling everything wrong? All right, and those will be due that Wednesday before the final, so that you can get feedback before. So that would be the 21st. And then our final is on the 23rd. We good on that so far? Everybody thought the same thing that I thought? All right. So we're going over the nervous system today. And what's cool about the nervous system is that we really, really need it. It's very important. Just a second, I gotta make sure. So the nervous system, it's divided into a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system, and that's the different divisions that we're going to talk about. Your central nervous system is abbreviated CNS, and your peripheral nervous system is PNS. So if you see those words throughout the lecture today, there are different types of neurons. Neurons are like nerve cells. We're going to talk about the structure of a neuron. We're going to talk about the parts of the brain and their function. And then it says, what are the parts of the peripheral nervous system? That's that PNS that I was talking about before. All right. So here's a little diagram about that human nervous system. So when you think of the nervous system, you think of your brain and your spinal cord. Most people think of it when it's related to pain, but that's not necessarily the case all the time. Our brain and our spinal cord are communicating to the rest of our body for pretty much almost any type of function, whether that be walking, talking, hormones. I'm trying to think of a lot of other things that we can do. Sensory receptors and reacting to stimuli, all kind of stem from our brain and our spinal cord. In our kind of head and skull area, we have cranial nerves, and they have different parts. There's 12 parts of cranial nerves. And then you have cervical nerves that kind of go down with our cervical vertebrae, which is kind of nice that they named them similar to the bones that we talked about last week. You have your thoracic nerves, your sciatic nerve. Maybe you've heard of people like complaining about their sciatica or their sciatic nerve. That's kind of in that low back, a little bit above the pelvis region. You have your lumbar nerves, your sacral nerves, and the coccygeal nerves. All of those are pretty much named after the vertebrae that they are involved in. And the spinal cord kind of runs down the center of that. So when you think of your vertebrae is protecting that spinal cord. I think of it like as the main telephone line for communication throughout our body. All right, I talked about the two divisions on that first slide. So there's essentially two parts or two divisions to the nervous system. Oops, there we go. The central nervous system, also known as CNS, is the brain and the spinal cord. And I would consider that maybe the most common part of the central nervous system or of the nervous system in general. It's the part that people like think about when you think of your nervous system. You think of your spinal cord and your brain. But the other really important part is our peripheral nervous system, or our PNS. And this is essentially all the branching of the nerves from the spinal cord and the brain to the tips of our fingers and our arms, all the way down our legs. Everything else, all that small, very specific branching is called the peripheral nervous system. It's made of nerves and ganglia. And so you can kind of see on the diagram here that the brain, we know what the brain looks like, and then your spinal cord, which is down the middle of your vertebrae, but then the rest of the nervous system, the cranial nerves, the ganglia outside of the central nervous system, and the spinal nerves, and all those nerves that I was talking about in the last slide, those are considered your peripheral nervous system. Okay. So your central nervous system is communicating with your peripheral nervous system, and that works through different things such as voluntary movements, involuntary movements, when you're resting and digesting food, when you have an adrenaline rush of fight or flight. All of these are ways that our central nervous system communicates with each other, but also the environment around us. So let's talk about like an involuntary movement. So your autonomic nerves, that's that A word right here, autonomic nerves. This is that signal that carries from the smooth muscle to the cardiac muscle and the glands. And this is all of that involuntary kind of process. So you can think of this as all the smooth muscle, for example, like in your digestive system, so specifically your esophagus, your stomach, all those things that are involuntary. Your lungs, when you're breathing, when you're exhaling, that's smooth muscle tissue. These are involuntary movements, which means it's the things that your body, you're not consciously thinking of, but the processes are going on. The opposite of autonomic nerves is a somatic nerve system. And these are all the voluntary movements, such as walking, talking. These are the nerves that connect to muscle and tendons and skin, which allow for the way that I move my arms when I'm talking, the actual act of talking. These are somatic nerves. It's my brain communicating with the peripheral nervous system and spinal cord of my skeletal muscle, tendons, and skin simultaneously to allow for my mouth to create some words. At the bottom here, then on the autonomic nerve side, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. And these are two sets of nerves that often signal the same effectors and have opposite effects. So when you hear of your sympathetic and your parasympathetic division, these are involuntary movements, which is why it's on the left side under involuntary over here. And this is the things that your body may do that you'd kind of think would be somatic nerves, but it's not. So for example, fight or flight. If you're ever in a dangerous situation and you feel like you need to get out of that dangerous situation and your body is kind of reacting to that external stimuli, there comes a point where you're not thinking and your body just reacts. It may have communicated with your leg muscles and things like that to get yourselves out of that situation, but you weren't saying, okay, it is now time to go. There's just some silly and interesting situations with that fight or flight, those kind of adrenaline rush situations. And on the flip side of that, you've got your rest and digest. This is essentially when you're just sitting there watching Netflix and you're resting. But what you maybe don't realize is that your body is actually going through a rest and digest phase. It's also kind of an interesting statement, but if you've ever been in a fight or flight situation, maybe in a sports game or in an argument or things like that, your body doesn't need to go to the bathroom because it's not resting and digesting food at the moment. It's worried about the fight or flight. These are two different divisions of the central nervous system. And they have to be kind of on the extreme levels to get to that involuntary movement. So let's talk about the communication and how information is processed from the environment through the nervous system to essentially help protect us, because that's what our nervous system is doing. It's providing us with protection. It provides us with, the reactions to external stimuli. It can also help us kind of process things around us. So that information that is processed, its input, or what it was into, was some sort of sensory input. That could be something you saw with your eyes, felt with your hands, smelled with your nose, things like that. All of that is sensory input, okay? And that sensory input then is sent to the brain. The brain then processes whatever information that is and sends it out to a motor neuron or a motor output, okay? I think of this kind of like a computer example. So if you wanted to type an essay for class, you'd probably open up a Word document or a Google Doc or something, you'd start to type. By you typing, you're giving information to the computer about what you want to see on the screen, okay? And then you say, okay, now I want to print my document so I can turn it into my teacher. That's that motor output, essentially. So it's a way that you're putting information in, the computer puts it onto a document and sends that information to the printer. It's essentially like that motor output. Another example would be if you saw a fire in the woods, okay, you just recognized it, you're out for a walk, you can see that there's a fire. What you're recognizing is with your eyes, okay, your brain is kind of processing or going through some situations like maybe I should call the fire department, maybe I should run away because it's dangerous, all those things. And whatever action comes out of that is the motor output, whether that be dialing on a phone, that is a motor output, because your brain is telling you to do something with your hands or your legs, for example, like getting out of a situation. The green part here, it kind of looks yellow on the screen today, but that's your central nervous system or your CNS. Your peripheral nervous system is the sensory input and your motor output. So that's where you see those two divisions. I just think of it, like I said, your brain and your spinal cord are like the main telephone poles in communication. And then your peripheral nervous system is all that specific branching kind of down your arms and legs, the specific small nerves, whether that be like the specific houses of people who, hook up to an electrical or a phone system. There are 3 different types of neurons. One we mentioned in the previous slide, which was the sensory neurons, and these detect stimuli and send signals to motor neurons or interneurons. So stimuli could be anything from really bright lights or really dim lights, okay? Probably, maybe after being in the classroom today with the blinds pulled, you're gonna walk outside right away and your eyes are gonna recognize that it's a little bit brighter outside than it was in the classroom, and then you have that moment where your eyes kind of adjust. That's a sensory input that your brain then processes as how much your eyes should dilate, and then it resends the information back to your eye saying, adjust to the certain amount of light that we have here. That's sensory neurons. It's the same thing if you touch something or you step on a rock and it's kind of pointy and it hurts, and then you kind of pull your leg back up. That was a sensory neuron communicating as an output to a motor neuron. Then you have interneurons. The root word there being inter, if you've ever heard of like intramurals in college, like maybe you guys play intramural volleyball or intramural bowling or I don't know what else, basketball, things like that. That would be teams that you maybe play within your own college. Maybe you play against a teammate or against a team that lives down the hall from you, okay? Intercollegiate athletics is like when Wartburg plays Luther or when Wartburg plays Loris and things like that. So it's like another college versus another college. So the difference between those words are inter and intra. Okay, so this is one where you heard like intramurals as a way to remember it, and this one's like intercollegiate. All right, there we go. Okay, so what is an interneuron? This is integrated information and sends signals from one to another motor neuron. So for example, like the neurons that connect your quads and your hamstrings, they have to communicate, right? When I'm walking, when I pick up my leg, I'm contracting my hamstring, relaxing my quad, and as soon as I step down, I'm contracting my quad and relaxing my hamstring. And every step, and whether that means I'm walking or running, those neurons are communicating back and forth to each other, but they know not to go all the way up to the central nervous system and back down every single time. So those are like interneurons. And then you have motor neurons, which carry signals to the effectors. So these are also your muscles and your glands. Okay, motor neurons. When you think of the word motor, you probably think of like a car, okay, or a jet ski or a motorcycle or something that has a motor in it, okay? It's probably creating some sort of movement, right, in a car, getting from point A to point B, a four-wheeler, a motorcycle, whatever those things are that have a motor, they're turning the wheels, right, in those examples. These motor neurons are essentially telling the muscles and glands to contract or excrete certain things. Glands, for example, is what we're going to go over a little bit on Friday, but glands contain a lot of different hormones. So if you've ever had a stressful situation and maybe you feel your face getting really hot and your palms are sweaty or whatever your reaction to stress is, that is your central nervous system reacting to some external stimuli, and then your glands are reacting by sending hormones in different directions depending on what that stimuli made you feel. Those are feelings. Yes, it's kind of like the Disney movie, what is it? Inside Out? Mm-hmm. Kind of like that, right? So, but not like that, sort of like that. Okay, so you've got your motor neurons, and then it says it carries signals to the effectors, the things that are affected. So you touch you touch the hot stove when you're a little kid and you don't realize it, and you pull your hand back really quick. You didn't think, okay, now I need to pull my hand back, and then you pull your hand back. Your brain recognized that that was a hot surface and it reacted to that stimuli, and your brain didn't want your hand to burn off because that wouldn't be good, and so it pulls it back. Okay, those are those motor neurons. It's carrying the signals to the effectors. The difference between that and the interneurons is that this is integrated information and sends signals to one another, to the motor neurons. So what I was thinking here is like, anybody else's brain look like that today? Yeah, mine does. Okay, and then a motor neuron, like say your quadricep or your hamstring or your arm or things like that. Okay, or a gland such as like your pituitary gland. Okay, so we're carrying information, the motor neuron, to the effector, if this is the brain. Okay, and this is the spinal cord. Bless you. Okay. The difference between that is then maybe the quad and the hamstring in another example, or the quad and the patella tendon need to communicate to each other. That would be an interneuron. I'm just going to put inter because I don't want to waste your time. Okay, so that's kind of where the difference between inter and motor is happening. The motor is getting information from the primary source and sending it straight to the quadricep. But then as you start to walk, you're like, okay, now I need to walk to class. Sends the motor to your motor neurons, and then as you're walking, these are talking to each other, kind of back and forth. All right, here's a little bit more about the types of neurons. Okay, so we have A, B, and C in this picture, and I'm sorry if it's not great. You can also see this in your book on figure 14.2, the structure of sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons, okay? So a little bit about the specifics of a neuron. I can tell that this looks like a neuron even without the labels because it's a very unique type of cell, okay? So neurons are nerve cells. And what's really cool about them is most of the time they have this kind of tree-like root system of branching that branches off between them. They have this myelin sheath that kind of looks like beads on a string, or if you were ever like a runner and you had one of those things that you roll out on your leg, it kind of looks like one of those. You could think of it, it looks like marshmallows on a stick. That's kind of what it looks like here. That's that myelin sheath. The cell body is here and here and here, and there's different types of those neurons, okay? So for example, you can see the kind of arrow here. It says the direction of conduction, because this is an electrical current. Yes, an electrical current that is flowing through your body constantly. Anybody take physics ever? Okay, if you haven't. Maybe here or in high school?
Yeah, I did it with Bechtel.
Oh yeah, fun. Yeah, so you've probably heard of the word conduction before. Yeah, very nice. So this is the direction of conduction, or essentially the direction of the electrical current that's going on here, okay? The three neurons that we're looking at are sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron. Although this picture is not fantastic for you guys unless you're looking at it straight on, the motor neuron has a lot of branching on it, especially compared to the sensory neuron, okay? And then the interneuron has a lot of branching, but not as much as the motor neuron, okay? The middle is called the cell body, and it contains the nucleus. Yes, this has genetic information in it. And then we have axons and dendrites. These are really important. So I'll draw something over here that'll kind of help you. So when I'm identifying a nerve cell, okay, so this is a nucleus. This is a cell body. Okay, and then I mentioned these two words called axons and dendrites. And you can see here, there's an axon, and these are dendrites. So it just depends on the flow and where the electrical current is going. But for example, we'll work top to bottom here. It doesn't necessarily need to do that. Well, let's say that this is a dendrite, and this is how information is brought into the nerve cell. So this is in the direction, essentially, if you're like reading a book from left to right, this is where we're starting at the left side. And then how neurons communicate to each other, then maybe we have another neuron down here. I'll just draw it like a kind of a star. And then you have another neuron, you have another one. And then this one also talks to this one. It's like gossiping in college, right? Okay, so then you have the axon is how you communicate from neuron to neuron. Okay, while axons and dendrites can kind of be mistaken easily, okay, these are all communication, random branching. The way that I like to think of it is like, although this in my picture is super long and we know it's an axon, this is also an axon down here. But this is also a dendrite, because an axon connects to the next dendrite, and the dendrite goes through the cell body and through the axon, and then it goes through the dendrite, the cell body, and the axon. So dendrite, cell body, axon. But this right here is the same as this, and that's how they communicate to each other. So you've got your axon, dendrites, cell body. You can't really, this is not a great picture for you guys up here, I apologize. It's much better if you have the PowerPoint right in front of you, or if you want to review it on the YouTube video. But that's a little bit about the types of neurons and a little bit about what they look like. And to go more in detail, this picture is a little bit better for you. So we have that cell body, which I drew a big arrow to on the board. This is the main cell of the nucleus where most of the organelles reside, because yes, although we think of like animal and plant cells that have organelles, and you think of that science project you had to do once with the styrofoam and you had to like put, you know, M&Ms on it and label it and whatever. That's what you think of a cell, but this is also a cell, and it has a nucleus and organelles, and it has DNA, but it just looks a little bit different. Because of what it needs to communicate and how it's communicating. So the dendrites, like I said, are those short extensions that receive the signals and carry the impulses to the cell body. And then the axon is a single long extension that carries impulses away from the cell body, transmitting signals. But then the axon talks to the dendrite of the next cell, which then talks to the axon, which talks to the dendrite, which talks to the axon, all the way down. So that's a pretty important part of communication. And this is happening faster than you can think, and also very specific pathways. When you think of whenever somebody says like muscle memory, if you've ever heard that term before, like, oh, I learned this one song on the piano when I was 7 and I can still play that song even though I've never practiced it before. Or you take your driver's test when you're 16 years old and you don't have to take another driver's test for a little while and you still know how to drive, right? It's just part of muscle memory. Or you used to bowl as a kid and now you're really good at bowling, but you don't practice as much as you used to. Muscle memory. Your muscles kind of remember the patterns in which things happen. That's your neurons actually communicating from your brain to your muscle. That's the muscle memory. They're remembering how to communicate to each other. Or you could think of it the other way, which you're like, oh, my muscle memory is just not working, or you're kind of in your head in a sports game or something. You just can't throw the ball like you used to, or things like that. It's just trying to get that muscle memory back, maybe going through some motions to essentially communicate. So here's a little table just talking about dendrons. That's funny. It's like their couple name, dendrons. Dendrites and axons. So dendrites, like I said, they carry information towards the cell body. There's one per cell in most sensory neurons. So we saw that in the picture before here, that there's only one dendrite for a sensory neuron, but for a motor neuron, there can be many dendrites, okay? They do branch, and they are branching close to that cell. It kind of looks like a paint splat or a firework, kind of. And it is not insulated by the sheath. So when I talked about that marshmallow on a stick thing, it kind of insulates the conduction, which kind of is cool for our neurons. That's that myelin sheath, those marshmallow things, or that beads on a string. Whereas axons, they carry information away from that cell body, and there's usually one per cell in most neurons. They branch further from the cell body, so then they start to branch a little bit further down because they need to talk to other neurons, and they are insulated by the myelin sheath for the most part. Okay, these are pretty important for all bodily functions, from things that you don't think about to the ones you do. So here's this myelin sheath I talked about. There's those marshmallows they kind of look like marshmallows, right? On the string, and the string is the axon, okay? These layers are called myelin, and it's made up of these Schwann cells. I don't know why does anybody think of like the Schwann's people with the frozen truck that drives around? I feel like I used to get that as a kid. Do those still exist?
Yeah, I get it every week.
Yeah,
2 weeks.
their food was great. The ice cream, the frozen. Anyways, this is, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's this truck that drives around and sells frozen food, and it's pretty cool. And you can get it like delivered, like you said, once a week or once a month or things like that. But anyways, they're called the Schwann's people, and their brand is called Schwann's. That's what I think of when I think of a Schwann cell. That's pretty far-fetched. Has nothing to do with neurons. And then you have the nucleus of the Schwann cell here. And as each myelin sheath kind of works its way down, it insulates the axon because it's an electrical signal. And it's a conduction, and it moves in one direction to the motor neurons or the interneurons or the sensory neurons or however it's communicating. So it's really important. And as you can see down here, it also branches further away from that cell body like we talked about in the previous slide. So it says the Schwann cells support the neurons and are essential for normal functioning of the nervous system. Great. Schwann cells form the myelin sheath. Great, we talked about that. A lipid covering over axons is to increase the speed of nerve impulse conduction and also acts as insulation. It also, when you think of insulation, you can think of a couple of things, right? Like if it's really cold outside, and you have to go, I don't know, sit outside for some reason. Maybe you're going fishing with your dad, or maybe you're, I don't know, sitting outside at a sporting event and it's really cold. I don't know why else somebody else would sit outside. Why would you sit outside? Give me an example. Camping. If you like to go camping. All these things. But you're going to put a lot of layers on, right? You're going to kind of try to insulate your body heat. You're going to put on the long sleeve and the sweatshirt and the coat and the 2 pairs of socks and 2 pairs of pants and the boots and the hat and the coat. Pretty much every Iowa winter, right? You're insulating your body heat. You're trying to kind of extend the release of your body heat into the air by kind of keeping it close to your body, okay? That's kind of what these myelin sheaths do, is they insulate it. It also works to increase the speed of the nerve impulse of the conduction. So it's an electrical signal. So if we can kind of concentrate it with these myelin sheaths, we can kind of keep it on the same path. I also think of it like, it's like me making a list before going into Target instead of just going without a list, if you know what I mean. You're just going all over the place. You're like, oh, I want a little bit of this. I want a little bit of this. But if I have my list, I'll stick to my list. That's kind of what these myelin sheaths do. They kind of keep it on the path so that it's effective and it insulates that conduction, that electric current. The central nervous system, like I said, is made up of that brain and spinal cord. We've seen this picture before. Here's a cool picture to kind of show you what that may look like. Brain cells are also known as neuroglia, which is kind of a cool word to say if you want to sometime. Neuroglia cells make up the bulk of the brain itself. And these cells insulate and support the neurons. So these neuroglia are supporting the neurons that help communicate with the rest of our body. And like, as you can see, a lot of branching is happening. You can see the branching all over. I mean, we can't even count how much is there. And these neuroglia, they look like fireworks or like electrical signal or a lightning strike. We also want to protect the brain. So the brain is kind of like the headquarters, right? That's why we're really big on right now with like sports injuries and concussions, because the brain, you kind of only get one of those, as far as I know. And especially with a lot of nerve cells not being able to rejuvenate or kind of repair themselves, brain damage can be really serious. So what does our brain do in the meantime to help kind of protect ourselves? Because, I mean, I played soccer. It was an impact sport, and I'd head the ball, and, oh, man, you bump your head on the door, or, you know, that we're clumsy people, at least I am, right? We've got some stuff in place already to protect our brain so we don't all have to walk around with helmets on, right? So we have these things called meninges, and these are membranes that cover the brain. It kind of looks like, the outside of a balloon, kind of, it's moist, a membrane kind of covering the brain. So those are called the meninges, okay? Then you've got your cerebrospinal fluid, and this is what bathes and cushions the brain. So there's fluid, although you can't really, it's hard to think about. You've got your skin on your forehead, and a little bit we're gonna talk, you know that we have a skull, right? And that skull is made up of different bones. It's kind of like a helmet we wear all the time. But then on the inside of the skull, you have this, first we have the blood-brain barrier, and then you have your cerebral spinal fluid. And it's kind of like, if you think of putting something in a jar of liquid, that's kind of what we're doing here. It's trying to decrease the impact of the brain kind of damaging itself by either hitting the skull or something hitting the brain. It's kind of like this impact barrier. So the blood-brain barrier, this stops harmful substances from reaching the brain. This is also, it's kind of like in our blood system. It's how, like if we were to eat or drink something that was poisonous or things like that, it stops the harmful toxins and things from reaching the brain. But we do know that, like, for example, alcohol can reach the brain, right? That's why people kind of act silly when they're drinking alcohol or under other substances, right? Because it gets through that blood-brain barrier. So these are three kind of protective mechanisms that the brain has to protect from chemicals and impact, and also the meninges that are kind of like a cover for the brain as well. And we know that also we have our skull too. So here's a cross, a lateral cross section of the human brain. So essentially, if I were to have a brain here, we cut it in kind of longitudinal way. And you can see the different parts of the brain. Lucky for this class, we don't have to memorize every single part. I took neurobiology as my elective in my undergrad, so I did have to memorize all these parts. I'd probably have to review them again because there's a lot of very specific parts. But some of the most important ones that you'll need to know, the first one down here is the medulla oblongata. That's a fun one to say if you've ever got the time to do that. This one kind of keeps us breathing, which is really important. That medulla oblongata is important for involuntary movement and breathing specifically. You have your cerebellum, which is kind of back here. So here's that medulla oblongata. You have your cerebellum. This word reminds me of the word Cinderella, and it reminds me of Cinderella spinning around because this one helps with our balance. So if somebody ever gets, you know, kind of hit on the back side of their head right here, it can affect their balance. It also can be because of, you know, substances and things like that. You've got your midbrain. Another important one right here, it's kind of small, your optic nerve, which is important for eyesight. If you ever go see an optometrist, you're going to the eye doctor. That's your optic nerve. Your corpus callosum, your hypothalamus is really important, and your thalamus. Your pineal gland location is right in here, which is a gland, and glands are important for the secretion of different hormones that can affect mood, behavior, and how you react to stimuli. It can help with like reproductive things and things like that as well. So let's talk about the brain and the brain stem. So we see the brain, and then we kind of like cut it off right here at the bottom, but we know that it keeps going down. That's our spinal cord, right? So the brain stem is essentially, you can think of it like a plant. Like this is the flower up here, the really important part, and then this is the stem. The stem provides like the nutrients to the flower and things like that. But this, the brain stem is made up of three parts that are really important. The first one we talked about in the last slide, the medulla oblongata. Does anybody know the movie Medulla oblongata? Somebody gets mentioned about that? Waterboy, anyone? Yeah, maybe? Okay, maybe you need to rewatch it. Medulla oblongata, this contains the reflex centers for regulating breathing, like I said, heartbeat, and blood pressure. So those are some pretty important things that we are thankful that we don't have to think about all the time, especially that breathing one and the heartbeat one, and blood pressure. So this is like regulating your livelihood, essentially. The midbrain is then kind of in this lighter blue color in the middle. And this is the relay station, or essentially like the train station between the brain and spinal cord, and it helps with vision and hearing. And then you've got your pons, which is right up here in the purple color, which I don't know if it shows up purple for you. I don't know what's wrong with the colors on the screen. But this helps bridge between the cerebellum and the central nervous system that regulates the rate of breathing, which is specific to the pons, and the reflex center for head movements. Okay, so you can think of like if somebody were to, you know, kind of clap in front of your face really fast, you know, your eyes blink and maybe move your head back, and it was just a reflex and you didn't think about it. That's like reflex of the center of the head movements and things like that, which is also protecting your eyes and your head and your face, right, when you have a reflex and things like that. Then we have what I talked about before, the cerebellum. This receives and integrates sensory input from the eyes and ears and joints and muscles about the current position of the body. So you've maybe felt this before. If you close your eyes and then, you know, you turn off all the sound and there's no lights in the room and you spin around 5 times fast and you kind of like lose your sense of where you're at and you maybe feel a little dizzy, that's your cerebellum, because your cerebellum is constantly being like, eyes are here, ears are there, you know, my feet are on the ground, I'm balanced, things like that. It's kind of constantly processing kind of where that position of the body is relative to its surroundings. It helps maintain posture. It coordinates voluntary movement. So anything from walking, dancing, voluntary movement, running, skipping, other voluntary movements, talking. It allows learning of new motor skills. So you can teach an old dog new tricks, playing the piano or hitting a baseball or all those other skills, knitting, painting, singing, all of those things that you're teaching your body to do. Maybe it's a little awkward at first, but you're essentially talking with your cerebellum and saying, hey, my relative positioning needs to be here and here and here. And it's why practice makes perfect, is because we're kind of teaching those motor neurons to communicate with the cerebellum to be at a relative position at a certain amount of time. Okay, a little bit more, but this is about the cerebrum, which is this big yellow part here. The cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain, okay? People get that mixed up with cerebellum. There's like a couple of letters different, but this is cerebrum. And the cerebrum is, like I said, that largest part. It's for sensory information, is analyzed. So when you smell your favorite food from the Mensa, and you're like, ooh, that's my favorite meal, I can't wait, I'm so excited, your body input the scent through your nose, and it was processed in your cerebrum and analyzed. You were able to connect a stimuli or a sensory to an experience. And that's how that sensory information is analyzed. And it also is the motor commands that are issued and how language is generated. So that's pretty important. It's also somewhat specific to humans because we have a complex language system, where other animals and organisms do communicate in other ways, like barking or meowing or clucking or chirping or all those other things. They can communicate with each other, but what's different about humans is that we have this complex communication system where we kind of teach our mouths to go in a certain way or make a certain sound at a certain time. And I'm able to talk really fast right now, but you're still processing and hearing what I'm saying. The cerebrum, that big yellow part, is actually broken up into 4 kind of more specific lobes. And these lobes are called frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. And they are important for different things. And this gets really specific too if you've ever heard of somebody who has a brain injury or a stroke, and where that is located and how it can affect these certain things that I'm going to talk about next. So for example, the frontal lobe is kind of like this front part of our brain here, and it's the primary motor area, and it's the conscious thought. So it's like the, I'm hungry right now, or I have to go to the bathroom, or like all those things that you talk to yourself about. That's that conscious thought, like I'm going to go, you know, plug in my laptop now, and you like plug it in. That's that conscious thought. That's your frontal lobe, okay? Your temporal lobe is kind of underneath the frontal lobe, kind of like right between the ears. This is the primary auditory, smell, and speech area. So like I said, being able to recognize smell and talking and things like that, that's your temporal lobe. Your parietal lobe is kind of behind the frontal lobe, but on top of the occipital lobe and temporal lobe. And this is the primary somatosensory and taste area. So recognizing different tastes of food. Maybe your mom or your grandma or somebody makes a certain dish at a holiday and it just takes you back to your childhood. That's your brain connecting that sort of taste to a certain event in time, or also like a relatively, you know, favorite taste or things that you do or don't like. Maybe you're just like really big into strawberries, like you love strawberries, so your brain will recognize like, ooh, that has some strawberry in it, like recognizing taste and kind of connecting that. And then you have your occipital lobe. This is primary visual area. which makes sense, right? We were talking about like where that optic nerve is located. This is where we're talking about down here. This is that visual area, being able to see and process sounds, and auditory as well is down here. So this picture is really cool because it kind of shows you like where at in the brain and how it affects the different types of sensory inputs and outputs. Okay, so we have your left and right cerebral hemisphere. And you've maybe heard the rumor that like if you're left brain dominant or right brain dominant, and one means you're more creative and one means you're more analytical or things like that. Kind of a rumor, but kind of true. There is a thick band of axons called the corpus callosum that provides communication between the right and the left hemispheres. So now we're talking about like if I had a brain here, I'd cut it down in half the way that we were looking at it before. So you have a left and a right brain. And remember, it also has to be anatomical view. So this is my left brain, even though when you guys are looking at me, this is your right side. So that's why we're also looking at kind of like a back side of a brain. We're kind of looking at it like this. Left hand, left cerebral hemisphere, and then you have that corpus callosum, which is those bands of axons that are between the left and the right hemisphere. Okay, so what do our left and our right hemispheres actually do? Well, our left hemisphere, it adapts to language, math, logistical operations, and processing of sequences or serial sequences. So this is like that, oh, you're more left brain dominant, you like to be analytical, things like that. Well, it's not true. It's not like you're actually dominant in your left brain. It's more so personality traits and how your nerves have reacted to either your environment and situations. You'll also notice, like, for example, if you have a favorite class, it's most likely because you either performed well, you liked people in that class, or you did an activity you really liked or a topic that you liked, and now it became your favorite class. It's the same thing. You all have left and right hemispheres, and they're all working, but if you're left brain dominant, it's probably because you have a connection in some way to the left hemisphere of your brain. And then you have your right hemisphere, which is stronger in pattern recognition, nonverbal thinking, and emotional processing, all of which are very important. Just a little bit about your spinal cord. Oops, did I go too far? There we go. Your spinal cord and what it looks like. Luckily for us, we don't have to memorize the parts of your spinal cord, but just to kind of give you a sense of what's going on here, you can see the vertebrae around the outside. Your vertebrae protect your spinal cord. Your spinal cord is made up of white matter and gray matter. Somebody just named it. I don't know why it's called white and gray matter. A little bit to what color it is, but not exactly. The spinal cord then has spinal nerves that come off to the side, as you can see over here. So you have your spinal cord, you have your vertebrae, and then you have your spinal nerve, and then the spinal nerves connect to the peripheral nervous system. So when we're sending information down your spine and out to the other types of nerves that need to have some sort of reaction. So this is figure 14.7, and it's just showing the organization of your spinal cord. Here's a dissection of a cross section of a spinal cord, which is really cool. You can see that it was cut in half here, and you can see the dorsal root branches. And you can see that the cut vertebrae here, the spinal cord and the spinal nerves kind of coming off to the side. So the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, it includes the cranial nerves, which are the nerves that kind of branch off from your cranium, if you've ever heard of that word before, the game cranium. Then you have spinal nerves, which makes sense if we have 32 vertebrae, that you have 31 pairs, or 33 vertebrae, 31 pairs that are coming off the spinal cord. The cranial nerves conduct impulses to and from the brain, and then the spinal nerves conduct impulses to and from the spinal cord. They kind of all connect eventually to each other, but where they're located is kind of what they're communicating to. The PNS, or the peripheral nervous system, it's divided into those two systems that we've already talked about, the somatic and the autonomic. Remember that slide with the red words kind of tilting off to the side? So you have your somatic, which is your voluntary movement, your walking, your talking, your thinking. And then you have your autonomic division, your involuntary movement, your rest and digest, your fight or flight, all of the things that are going on, your breathing in your body that are involuntary, or essentially not conscious thinking. So a little bit more about that autonomic division. You see the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So a little bit about that. Does anybody need this? Can I erase it? Okay, you can think of it like a chart. So you have your peripheral nervous system, okay, and we kind of branch it off into two, and you have your autonomic. Make sure I spell it right. I'm not great at spelling. Autonomic, and then it is broken up into your parasympathetic. And sympathetic. Okay, and the difference between these two is kind of described here on this slide. So the sympathetic, it coordinates the body for flight or fight response, speeding up the metabolism, heart rate, and breathing, and slowing down and regulating other functions. This is what I was talking about before. Like if your house, you know, hopefully it's not on fire, but if your house was on fire and you had to hurry up and run out to, you know, and be safe and things like that, your body's not going to be like, hey, you want to go to the bathroom really quick? Like, it just doesn't do that. But remember, it has to be at the extreme. So this is like your fight, flight, fight. Okay. And then you have the opposite of that, which is your parasympathetic. And this is kind of that rest and digest phase. This is where it like slows down metabolism, your heart rate, your breathing, and returns other functions to normal. So this is rest and digest. And you're just sitting there watching Netflix. Your body's on the parasympathetic stage. All right. Here's a little bit more about that autonomic division. And what's cool about this picture is the color coordination. And it may be hard to read it, but this is in your book. It's 1417. Okay, so you kind of have to work it down like a kind of like a trail or a maze. So let's go through the pink part, which is the norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter, and then the blue part is where acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. If you've ever heard of the word neurotransmitter, it's essentially the type of transmission. When you have acetylcholine or norepinephrine, it's just the type of reaction. So inhibiting tears, dilating pupils, inhibiting salivation, speeding up heart rate, dilating air passages, stimulating liver to release glucose. All of these things kind of in this pink magenta color up here are the norepinephrine neurotransmitter. Okay, this is where you'd see more of the sympathetic nervous system here. I'm just going to put like pink so I don't have to write norepinephrine. And then you've got the blue, which is more that parasympathetic, which is going to be the stimulating the tears, constricting the pupils, slowing that heart rate, stimulating salivation, which could help with digestion, constricts the bronchioles so that we're kind of not breathing heavy. So when you get stressed about something, or there's an intense basketball game on TV, maybe you're breathing a little bit more heavy, that's that fight or flight. Maybe the refs made a bad call. That never happens, right? And the blue over here, we also have like stimulates the gallbladder to release bile, which means you're digesting, your digestive system and your urinary system are working. You can see all of those over here, okay? You can also see where at in the spinal cord that it communicates, which is really cool. So you have your cervical nerves, your thoracic nerves, and your lumbar nerves. And they're broken down into green, lavender, and like a lighter pink over here, which is really cool about this description. And so if you were curious about like, oh, how does like orgasmic contractions work? Well, it's actually your lumbar nerves communicating to your reproductive organs that are doing that and things like that. So this is a really cool diagram. You can kind of look at the different pictures. You can trace the maze kind of as a pattern and things like that. All right, the other part I forgot to put on, oh, where did it go? Over here was your somatic. This is voluntary, and it communicates with your skeletal system. Most of the time, and your glands and things like that, but the one people tend to think about the most is the skeletal system, which is like bones and muscles, specifically muscles. Okay, so let's talk about what we talked about. So the different divisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. There are 3 types of neurons. You have the motor neurons, interneurons, and the sensory input neurons, okay? What is the structure of a neuron? We drew that over there on the board. The cell body, the nucleus, dendrites and axons are really important. What are the parts of the brain and their functions? So we didn't talk about every single part of the brain, but some of the ones that you maybe need to know were those 3 that were right at the top of the brain stem, which is the medulla oblongata, the midbrain, and the pons. And then you also have like your cerebellum and your cerebrum, which is broken up into 4 lobes. Remember, those 4 lobes have different sensory kind of processing areas. And then also, what is the function of the peripheral nervous system? So this is the peripheral nervous system, and it works for voluntary and involuntary movement. And I should probably write that up here too. So I said voluntary here, but this over here is involuntary. This is the stuff that you aren't thinking about. Your body's just going to react to, whether that's digesting food, exhaling, you know, reacting drastically to an external stimuli of some sort that you didn't even think about. That's kind of that autonomic system. So your peripheral nervous system, the function of it is how the electrical conduction of the signal that was sent, kind of what is the output of that, or what actually happens when our brain sends a signal. Well, it could be something involuntary or voluntary, but our brain is kind of sending those signals all along. It's also why when you're sleeping, you can continue to breathe, right? You're not thinking about it, you're relaxing, you're dreaming, things like that. Hopefully not in class, right? And then your medulla oblongata is still saying, and breathe, but you're not thinking about it, which is really cool. Does anybody have any questions about the nervous system? Or anything? Life? Yeah.
I noticed one of the questions for chapter 14 is like the top most common neurotransmitters in CNS and CNS. So what's the difference between neurons and neurotransmitters?
So neurotransmitters release a certain hormone, and the neurons are telling those neurotransmitters to release that hormone.
So is that like adrenaline, dopamine, stuff like that?
Yeah, serotonin, all of our favorite ones, right? Mm-hmm. Endorphins, right? Legally Blonde, right? Anybody? Working out makes you happy.
Did you say the neurotransmitter releases the hormone that the?
Yep, the nerve is telling it to.
Oh, okay.
So the nerve communicates to the neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter is released of some hormone. So we're gonna get a little over what we think about here. So if you think of like, we're communicating in this direction, okay? Then you have a cell of some sort. You've got like these different neurotransmitters on the outside of your cell. They're very small. And maybe this one is serotonin, and this one is dopamine, and maybe this one is norepinephrine, like we talked about with that pink and blue maze. I'm not going to write it, so I'm just going to write norepinephrine. And maybe there's another one, endorphins. Okay. And what your the electrical signal does is it's a chemical reaction then that is allowing for the release of that. It's like once it communicates with the cell, the chemicals work in a certain reaction to release that outside of the cell and into the bloodstream. So like this is like where the talk about like mental health comes into play a little bit too, because it's like a chemical imbalance. Because of, so the neuron, and it can happen on both sides, right? Like the neuron could be communicating to the cell, but this chemical reaction, it can be off. Or the communication from the brain can be off. That's why if somebody ever has like trauma to the brain and then they kind of maybe are moody at a certain thing, or they have like PTSD or things like that, it's how the brain is communicating with the cells, which is like telling which neurotransmitters to be released, which hormones to be released, kind of a thing. Does that kind of make sense? It's all very interesting stuff. People take a whole like semester class on this, or like get their whole degree in this too. So don't jump off the diving board of the deep end here. But you can if you're really interested, and I can talk about this all day. Any other questions?